Hello and welcome to the Wheels of History Podcast, Episode 9, The Contest of Wills. I'm your host, Brian Boyles. This is the final episode of our 5-part series on the Korean War, picking up where we left off with the Chinese counterattack having driven UN forces out of North Korea, and then going through the armistice negotiations and the end of hostilities 2.5 years later. Over the past 2 episodes, we had zoomed in on the respective fights on the west and east sides of Korea. 8th Army in the west being pushed back by the Chinese and then ultimately withdrawing so fast that they lost contact with the Chinese ground forces between the 3rd and 20th of December as they abandoned Pyongyang, blew up their supplies, and pulled back all the way to the 38th parallel. And while this was going on, the 1st Marine Division and its attachments, cut off and surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir, fought their way out of the trap, mauling an entire Chinese army group in the process. And then 10th Corps evacuated from Hungnam with all its supplies and vehicles, finishing up on Christmas Eve, with 10th Corps redeploying back to Pusan, and then from there moving up to take its position with 8th Army along the 38th parallel. Now, while this is happening, a tragic event occurred in 8th Army. On December 23rd, General Walker was traveling near Uijeongbu in his Jeep when a South Korean truck swerved out of its lane and collided with the Jeep, killing the general, and further adding to the dour mood in 8th Army. However, while the press cast the withdrawal from Pyongyang and the Chosin Reservoir in gloomy terms, in reality, the losses suffered by the UN command were relatively low, less than what the U.S. Army suffered in half a week's fighting during the Battle of the Bulge. Only the 2nd Infantry Division and the Turkish Brigade had lost a significant amount of combat power. However, at this point in the war, the extent of Chinese and broader communist intentions were unknown. Was this the prelude to a Soviet offensive in Central Europe and the start of World War III? Likewise, the U.S. government was going through its own soul-searching to determine what their strategic goals in Korea were now that the Chinese were involved in strength. Regardless, a new commander is needed for the 8th Army. General Matthew B. Ridgway, former commander of the 82nd Airborne Division and 18th Airborne Corps in World War II, receives the call. He flies out the following day and meets with MacArthur in Tokyo and is told to hold the line as far forward of Seoul as possible, but to withdraw if needed. Ridgway, always thinking of the offense, asks if he could counterattack, and MacArthur replies, quote, "The 8th Army is yours, Matt. Do what you think best." End quote. Upon taking command and addressing the troops, Ridgway quickly realizes that the 8th Army has lost its fighting spirit. Although they possessed superior equipment, logistics, and firepower to the Chinese, they had been psychologically beaten in the mountains of North Korea and lacked the will to fight. In military circles, there's always debates between what matters more, the material factors or the moral factors. And the truth is, you need them both. A well-equipped army that doesn't want to fight will melt like the Afghan National Army did, but likewise a poorly equipped army that fights like hell will also be defeated, like the Imperial Japanese forces in World War II. Well, Ridgway set about restoring the fighting spirit in the 8th Army, and he knew he had little time to do it. Over the course of 48 hours, he met with all his corps and division commanders, he talked with the soldiers, and exhorted them to find, fix, fight, and finish the Chinese forces. He also places a strong emphasis on addressing quality of life issues with the soldiers, improving the food the soldiers are getting, and addressing shortages of winter clothing among the ranks. He also makes strong efforts to reassure the ROK troops that UN forces aren't going to just pull out of Korea and abandon them to the communists. On New Year's Eve, the Chinese open a new offensive on the 8th Army, and they advance over the ridges and through the valleys, some of their soldiers even lacking rifles, which they would pick up from the dead. The ROK troops are hit hard and rout, abandoning their weapons and equipment. Ridgway resorts to setting up straggler posts with military policemen in the rear to round up and regroup the ROK forces. The 8th Army holds north of Seoul for 4 days and then pulls back 30 miles. Now this is an orderly retreat. 100,000 troops and their equipment pull back over the bridges of the Han River, and with the press of refugees threatening to clog the roads, Ridgway empowers the military police to fire warning shots and, if necessary, to fire on the civilians if they threaten to rush the bridges. Thankfully, they don't. Ridgway recalled, quote, "The scene is one that shall always live in my mind. Men, women, and children, patriarchs with storybook beards, grandmothers carried on their sons' backs like children, stolidly waiting their turn in the dusk and the near-zero cold, without a destination except some spot far away from the Chinese, with nothing left of them beyond what they could carry. A terrible procession of the meek and the disinherited, bound only to escape the terrors of communism and to cling to the freedom so briefly known." End quote. The front does stabilize, though, and he counterattacks on January 25th. Ridgway stays at the front in his personal forward command group, comprised of 2 aides, an orderly, 2 jeeps, and 2 small 8-by-12-foot tents. He tours the front regularly, studies the terrain, and at times even flies over the front in an AT-6 trainer aircraft, sometimes going beyond the front lines at treetop level to find signs of the Chinese. He sees nothing, not even trampled snow, and so he sets about conducting a deliberate advance to bring the enemy to battle, and to avoid overextending himself as 8th Army had done in the far north. The army advances some 20 to 30 miles, reaching the Han River again and retaking Wanzhou in the center. The Chinese, for their part, summoned their strength, and on February 11th launched a second major offensive, hitting the UN line in the center of Korea. Here, the 2nd Infantry Division has been reconstituted and placed back on the line, but history seems to repeat itself when the 8th ROK Division on the 2nd Infantry Division's flank collapses. Indeed, the Chinese are deliberately focusing their attacks on the ROK forces because the ROK divisions aren't as well equipped as the American forces and are more prone to break and run. Paul Freeman's 23rd Infantry Regiment, along with a French battalion, distinguished themselves in the fighting at a town called Chipyongni, some 20 miles northwest of Wanzhou. Facing several Chinese divisions, Freeman seeks approval to withdraw from Chipyongni to prevent encirclement. General Almond approves, but Ridgway says no, and as a result the reinforced regiment is surrounded by 5 Chinese divisions. Both the 23rd and the French battalion distinguished themselves in the fighting, and the French tend to get a bad rap in American circles, focusing on their hasty defeat at the hands of the Germans in 1940, but there's a lot of fighting spirit in them. Here the French battalion commander is Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Monclar, a gallant, distinguished soldier who was wounded 17 times over the course of his career. He was actually a lieutenant general, but in order to command the unit in battle, he asked to be reduced in rank to lieutenant colonel. When the Chinese sound their bugles and whistles in the night and begin their attack, the French crank a hand siren of their own, fix bayonets, and when the Chinese are only 20 yards away, they charge. The Chinese, despite outnumbering the French 4-1, flee. The perimeter holds, supplies are airdropped in during the day, and the Chinese attack resumes at night. The Chinese launch determined and relentless attacks to seize a hill on the perimeter, and to stop them, the artillerymen and support troops are pressed into service. Each Chinese attack gains a little more ground, and they attack again and again and again. They eventually succeed in breaching the defenses, but lack the forces to exploit it, due in part to their heavy casualties, and in part due to their primitive communications methods. During the day, the UN forces counterattack with every soldier they can muster, a platoon of rangers, a platoon of infantry, and a single tank. They failed to retake the hill, but re-established a weak defensive line, and ultimately the Chinese abandoned the hill the following night. This victory greatly raised the morale in the 8th Army as the defending forces, though surrounded, outnumbered, and repeatedly attacked, held firm and stopped the Chinese cold. The total cost to UN forces was 51 killed, 250 wounded, and 41 missing, to over 5,000 Chinese casualties. Within a few days, the Chinese offensive as a whole peters out with minimal gains and heavy losses. Ridgway counterattacks on February 20th with the aptly named Operation Killer, attacking with 2 divisions across the Han River east of Seoul with the intent of enveloping the city from the east. As the name implies, Ridgway's main concern was not territorial gain, but to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible with the fewest losses. It is a deliberate advance to avoid blundering into Chinese traps or ambushes, and leverages extensive use of air and artillery firepower combined with getting the infantry off the roads and onto the hills to drive the communists back. Of note, the Army Chief of Staff, General Lightning Joe Collins, protested that the name killer would hurt public relations. Ridgway later wrote, quote, "I did not understand why it is objectionable to acknowledge the fact that war was concerned with killing the enemy. I am by nature opposed to any effort to sell war to people as an only mildly unpleasant business that requires very little in the way of blood." End quote. Over 2 weeks, Operation Killer advances 10 to 15 miles and is followed by Operation Ripper, which leads to the recapture of Seoul and an advance to the 38th parallel. The ROK 1st Division liberates Seoul on the 15th of March, taking control of a shattered and devastated city, having changed hands 4 times now in less than a year. Only 200,000 civilians remain out of a pre-war population of 1.5 million. During the offensive, Ridgway flies his L-19 liaison plane near the front line, seeking places to land so he can get out and talk to the troops and encourage them in the attack, as well as observe firsthand how the offensive is going. In determining the objectives for the offensive, Ridgway is not concerned with the 38th parallel as a stopping point per se. The line itself, drawn arbitrarily across the map, is not defensible and doesn't take into account the variations of terrain. However, Ridgway also doesn't want to overextend himself, and so, in the west, the offensive stops at the Imjin River, which, on the western side of the peninsula, is slightly south of the 38th parallel, but in the east, they are a bit north of the parallel to include securing the Huachan Reservoir, which supplies water and power to Seoul. The troops are now confident and aggressive, having learned how to fight the Chinese, in particular at nighttime, forming tight perimeters to prevent Chinese infiltration attacks. By mid-April, there are indications that the Chinese have another counterattack in the making, and it lands on April 22nd. The Chinese push 3 field armies totaling nearly 700,000 troops against 400,000 UN and South Korean defenders. They push the UN forces back some 20 miles in the west along the corridor that leads past Dongdushan and Uijeonbu towards Seoul. Particularly heroic action fell upon the British Brigade and especially the 1st Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment. Some 6 Chinese divisions, 50,000 men, attacked the British Brigade alone. There is a Belgian battalion that's surrounded, but they hold firm and withdraw to friendly lines the following day. The Gloucesters, initially holding a 4-mile front, are also cut off and surrounded. Their perimeter shrinks to a circle only a few hundred yards in circumference, holding on to Hill 235, now known as Gloucester Hill. But they take heavy losses. Able Company is overrun completely, Baker is reduced to 16 men, and aerial resupply is largely ineffective due to the small perimeter and heavy fighting. The Chinese push past the Gloucesters, cutting off the Fusiliers and Ulster battalions as well, and hitting the brigade headquarters with small arms fire. Multiple tank-led counterattacks try to break through to Gloucester Hill, but all of them fail, and the British brigade is pushed back 7 miles. Fighting continues day after day. Ammunition runs low, radio batteries die, and ultimately, the battalion commander decides they need to break out. With so many wounded, he orders the able-bodied men to attack out, while he remains with the 458 wounded soldiers on the hill. The breakout party advances several miles without opposition, but are ultimately ambushed close to UN lines. During the ambush, though, American tanks advance north and engage the Chinese and the Gloucesters. The American platoon leader didn't think there were friendly forces so far behind lines. However, the Chinese are defeated, and the surviving 38 soldiers made it back to friendly lines out of an original strength of 622. Despite the casualties, though, they inflicted far more than they took. Across the line, UN forces had learned not to panic and instead to hold the line in the face of determined Chinese attacks, using their superior firepower to inflict massive losses on the Chinese. When forced to give ground, UN forces withdrew in good order, making the communists pay for every yard. After a week, the Chinese offensive ends after running out of strength, and an uneasy quiet falls across the front for the next 2 weeks. Then, in mid-May, another phase of the Chinese offensive hits 2nd Infantry Division and other UN forces in the center of the line, some 175,000 soldiers attacking. Once again, history seems to repeat itself, with the ROK formations on 2ID's flank, outnumbered, outgunned, and poorly led, collapse, exposing the flank. However, against the American tanks, artillery, and infantrymen, the Chinese are unable to make significant headway. Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Haynes, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 38th Infantry Regiment, is dug in on Hill 800. Over the preceding weeks, he made sure that his men dug in and deep. They had bunkers with overhead cover sufficient to withstand artillery bombardments, and he integrated landmines, trip flares, and wire with the defenses. The hill earns the nickname Bunker Hill, and the defenses are put to the test in the Chinese offensive. The Chinese bend 2ID's line back until Bunker Hill is at the tip of a salient. A lucky artillery round damages the radio, hampering their ability to call for fire on the Chinese, and a Green platoon leader pulls back, starting in general withdrawal until Lieutenant Colonel Haynes rallies his men and gets them back on top of the hill. However, the Chinese had taken over several of the bunkers on top of the hill, leading to a close-quarters fight in the trenches. When dawn comes, there are still 200 Chinese on the hill, and Lieutenant Colonel Haynes recognizes that he needs to drive them out before nightfall to restore their positions, so he personally leads a counterattack, pushing them back. However, the Chinese reinforce and attack during the night in overwhelming strength. Unable to hold them off, Lieutenant Colonel Haynes resorts to a desperate move. He has his men take cover in their bunkers and then calls artillery fire on his own positions using VT fuses, that is, variable time fuses. These fuses explode at a certain altitude above the ground, creating air bursts of shrapnel, and that fragmentation poses a significant threat to infantry in the open, especially if they're laying down on the ground, while minimizing the damage they could inflict against fortifications like the bunkers that Colonel Haynes' men are in. Some 2,000 105mm rounds explode over the course of 8 minutes, wiping out the Chinese on top of the hill. The Chinese attack a second time, and once again the Americans call in artillery on top of their own position, devastating the Chinese and forcing them to fall back. Ultimately, after several days of Chinese attacks, orders come down from 10th Corps to abandon Bunker Hill to consolidate the lines, but this is a deliberate withdrawal, and the Chinese had suffered grievous losses. Between the offensive in April and the second one in May, called the May Massacre due to the heavy losses they inflicted on the Chinese, the Communist forces suffer over 120,000 casualties in exchange for only 15,000 UN and ROC casualties. Exhausted and worn down, the time is ripe for a counterattack, and this time, when Ridgway goes on the offensive, the Chinese forces fall back and begin to rout. While all this is going on in the trenches and mountains of Korea, another drama is playing out back in Tokyo and Washington. General MacArthur was a passionate man who had swung in mood from absolute confidence and hubris from the landings at Incheon and driving north to the Yalu, to speaking doom and gloom following the Chinese entry of the war. Following Chinese intervention, MacArthur repeatedly pressed the Joint Chiefs for more troops to avert certain defeat, as well as unshackling the restrictions on bombing targets in Chinese territory or bringing in Chiang Kai-shek's National Chinese Forces into the fight. Of course, the Pentagon, and ultimately President Truman, did not want to widen the war by bombing China or antagonizing our allies by involving Chiang Kai-shek, even assuming that his troops would be effective, given that they had lost all of mainland China over the previous 5 years. Likewise, there was no appetite for employing atomic weapons and potentially bringing in the Soviets and sparking World War III, given the risks that would pose to a shattered Europe still rebuilding from the rubble of the Second World War. The Korean War was a limited war, and, with the Chinese now in the war, the goal was no longer absolute victory, it was a stalemate. The potential price in terms of lives to reach the Yalu, as well as the risk of the Soviets intervening directly, was simply not worth it. However, MacArthur still viewed the Korean War through the lens that most Americans had at the time, and had for many decades in the past. As Americans, we like to have clear-cut wars. If you're going to fight, then you fight to win. And if you aren't going to fight to win, then why fight at all? MacArthur's formative military experiences were in the trenches of World War I, where he was decorated 7 times for valor. He saw the slaughter of total war up close and personal, and he felt that such horrors should be avoided if possible, but if necessary, then there should be a corresponding purpose behind those deaths. Don't let the dead die in vain. So now here in Korea, facing the threat of communism, MacArthur sees a similar need to clearly win over the communists, not simply restore the pre-war borders and preside over a stalemate, but to show the communists that if they fought the West, they were going to lose. On March 24th, MacArthur made a press announcement without clearing it with Washington, and it stated, quote, "The enemy, therefore, must by now be painfully aware that a decision of the United Nations to depart from its tolerant effort to confine the war to the area of Korea, through an expansion of our military operations to its coastal areas and interior bases, would doom Red China to the risk of imminent military collapse." End quote. This suggested a radical change in UN policy towards directly engaging Chinese targets and blockading their coast, when in reality no such decision had been made. Then on April 5th, Representative Joe Martin, the opposition leader in the House of Representatives, read a personal letter from MacArthur. The congressman had written a letter to MacArthur back in March asking for his thoughts on the use of nationalist Chinese troops in Korea, and MacArthur's reply was that it would be totally consistent with logic and traditional U.S. policy to respond to force with maximum counterforce, and that he had submitted his views to Washington in complete detail. The fundamental issue here is that MacArthur was crossing the line by disobeying President Truman, his commander-in-chief. Back in December, Truman had directed all officials, including MacArthur, to abstain from making any foreign policy declarations. But MacArthur ignored it, and this brought up the ultimate question of who directs the military. Is it the generals at the top of the chain of command, or is there ultimately control of the military by the civilian government of the country? And it's clear in the Constitution that the military answers to the commander-in-chief, that is, the President of the United States, and the oaths we swear are to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, not loyalty to a particular leader. And as a result of this clear insubordination, Truman decides to relieve MacArthur. The plan was for the Secretary of the Army, who was visiting Korea at the time, to notify MacArthur in person before releasing word to the press at large. However, the Secretary of the Army was at a photo op at the front and couldn't be reached, and word of MacArthur's impending relief leaked to the press. And so, to get ahead of the press, Truman made an impromptu press conference to publicly announce it. MacArthur himself learns of the news from his wife, who heard it over the radio. This abrupt dismissal, and the way it was done, provoked a lot of anger at home, and became a major PR disaster for the Truman administration. MacArthur turned over command to General Ridgway on April 12th. He came back home to a ticker-tape parade, spoke before Congress, and ultimately faded away. General Van Fleet is brought in to command 8th Army. Ridgway, who had worked with MacArthur extensively as far back as the interwar period, believes that MacArthur was not a bloodthirsty warmonger. He didn't want to send U.S. ground forces into China, but he did want to employ the full superiority of U.S. naval and air power to isolate and devastate China's war-making potential, and potentially to enable Chiang Kai-shek's troops to retake the mainland. In his mind, once the Chinese entered the war, they were fair game to being attacked themselves, since they were the ones who escalated the conflict. Now, this decision wasn't within MacArthur's purview, and the U.S. government was unwilling to take the risk in terms of lives or starting World War III to win decisively against communism. There were many questions, too, about the feasibility of MacArthur's vision. Would this start World War III and cause the loss of Europe to the massive Soviet armies still stationed there? Would bombing, even atomic bombing, of China bring about a decisive result? Would Chiang's troops even be combat effective? And furthermore, since the U.S. intervened in the war under the auspices of the United Nations, would the U.S. be willing to go it alone if our allies didn't agree? And then what ripples would that cause for any future attempts at forming international coalitions to contain aggression if the leader of the coalition decides, well, I'm just going to do it my own way? And so, faced with the specter of World War III and nuclear war, the U.S. government decided that containment was a better policy, not letting the other side win, but also not pushing for a decisive win themselves. Ridgway, upon taking command and seeing his forces hold the line against the Chinese in April and May, saw that the initiative lay in their grasp. 8th Army counterattacked and retook the land the Chinese had gained in their spring offensives. Having learned how to fight the Chinese and being far better equipped, Ridgway thought that they could have continued the advance north and pushed the communists back past Pyongyang and even to the Yalu River, so long as the Soviets didn't intervene. However, given the mountainous terrain, the price would have been high, perhaps leading to 100,000 casualties. And regardless, the president wasn't willing to pay that price or run those risks. As Ridgway would later say, quote, To my mind, it is fruitless to speculate on what might have been. If we had been ordered to fight our way to the Yalu, we could have done it. If our government had been willing to pay the price in dead and wounded that action would have cost." End quote. The Communists, for their part, faced with the failure of their April and May offensives, and with the UN forces counterattacking, realized that they no longer had the military advantage they had enjoyed during the initial intervention in the winter. And so, unable to win on the battlefield, they decided to try winning at the negotiating table. On June 23, 1951, the Soviet delegate to the United Nations, after giving a speech with the usual accusations and complaints about the West's conduct of the war, conceded that the Korean War could be settled with negotiations, a ceasefire, and then an armistice. The Joint Chiefs informed Ridgway on the 25th that ceasefire negotiations might begin soon, and so Ridgway makes a plan to seize key terrain along the current line of contact in order to make sure that a prospective ceasefire line would be defensible. On June 30th, at the direction of Washington, Ridgway issues a message to the Communists that the UN would be willing to discuss a ceasefire and armistice. They agree to meet at Kaesong, a town south of the 38th parallel but north of the current UN lines. Though there is no official end to hostilities, Ridgway resolves to undertake no major offensives, to keep casualties to a minimum, and to seize that key terrain to form a coherent defensive line. Now the Communists are crafty fellows, and politics is always on their minds. In the Western world, we tend to separate military and civilian efforts into separate lanes. Let the generals do the fighting, and let the politicians do the politics. To the Communists, on the other hand, everything is political, and it probably stems from their worldview of history of the class struggle, and so everything, even a military campaign, tends to be viewed through political lenses. And sometimes the Communists even go overboard with their political officers having shared command with their military commanders, just to make sure that they're conducting their duties in line with the Marxist-Leninist ethic. Well, this is no exception. You see, the Communists are very aware of the optics and the propaganda value of how the negotiations are going to be conducted. You see, when originally trying to agree on where to hold the negotiations, Ridgway wanted to hold them at sea on a Danish hospital ship in Wonsan Harbor. The Communists ignored the suggestion and instead insist on doing the talks at Kaesong, and the UN decided to agree just to get negotiations going, not realizing that negotiating at Kaesong put them at a distinct disadvantage. They have to travel several miles through Communist lines to get there, driving with white flags on their vehicles, and creating the impression that the UN delegation is surrendering to the Communists. And of course, they take photos, and those are sent out around the world to garner support for the Communist side. Not only that, but the North Koreans gave Admiral Choi, the chief UN negotiator, a seat at the table substantially lower than theirs, and of course the press or UN photographers are not allowed at the site. Now the UN delegation is comprised of military leaders, the mindset being that the negotiation is for the ceasefire, which is primarily a military matter, and then once those lines have been drawn and the killing stopped, the politicians could step in and address the more complex political issues at hand. The Communists, though, brought both politicians and generals, and they protested everything. When Admiral Choi uses the term communist, they insist that they are only the Inmun-gun and Chinese volunteers and should be called as such. They insist that the 38th parallel, not the current frontline positions, should be the basis for a ceasefire line. And of course, the 38th parallel is not on defensible terrain, and UN forces are already dozens of miles north of the parallel in most of the country. And Admiral Choi would later state, quote, "Communists neither blunder into conferences nor rush pell-mell to engage in negotiations. First, they carefully set the stage. Their concern for maintaining face, as well as their regard for practical advantages arising from favorable negotiating conditions, causes the Communists to consider carefully the physical circumstances in which a parley is to occur." End quote. Ridgway would recount, quote, "For Westerners who have never been exposed to Communist negotiating tactics, I would say it is virtually impossible to conceive in advance the extent to which the truth is perverted and facts distorted. A tax is placed on patience that even Job would have found all but unendurable." End quote. The negotiations proceed for 30 days, but there is no consensus. They ultimately end on July 30th after the communists accuse the UN forces of dropping bombs at night in this neutral zone around the caisson. They insist on an immediate confession and apology and don't want to wait until daylight for a more thorough inspection. Daylight reveals that those bomb craters were merely grenade-sized holes, and so the UN forces broke off negotiations. Meanwhile, over the previous month, the front lines have been static, and the Chinese have used that time to bring in reinforcements, resupply their lines, and dig in. With the ceasefire talks suspended, but with the clear that UN forces don't want to push the communists further north, the war enters its most frustrating phase. T.R. Fehrenbach, author of the book This Kind of War, and who served as a company commander in the Korean War, would say that his instructions amounted to, quote, "Fight on, but don't fight too hard. Don't lose, but don't win either. Hold the line while the diplomats muddle through." End quote. The UN forces at this point only make limited offensives to straighten up their front lines. While this is happening, U.S. forces also start rotating their experienced troops out in exchange for fresh troops from the United States. Since this is a limited war, only a portion of the army is fighting in Korea, and, in an attempt at fairness, once soldiers accumulate enough points based on the time that they're serving in Korea and how dangerous their job is, they would rotate back to the States and a new soldier would take their place. This diluted combat experience, and many of the new soldiers had to relearn the hard lessons paid in blood by the previous troops. The ROK Army is also being strengthened and expanded. They would remain short on armor, artillery, and air power. Their numbers would grow until, by the end of the war in 1953, they would have some 600,000 men, comprising 2/3 of the combat troops at the front. Leadership remained their critical weakness, largely because it takes years to grow good leaders, and the Koreans were excluded from positions of leadership throughout the decades that they were under Japanese rule. Furthermore, there was plenty of corruption to go around. Leaders were selected for their political reliability and connections over competence, and in many cases the ROK soldiers were trying to take care of their families and would do things like divert trucks to haul firewood or sell gasoline on the black market. The Chinese also brought in new troops too, and the North Korean army is being rebuilt. With a month's respite from attacks, they spend that time digging in, deeper and deeper and deeper into the hills and mountains of Korea. They had experienced firsthand the air and artillery firepower that UN forces could bring to bear on them, and so, like in World War I, they simply went underground. These aren't just trenches, though. As General Ridgway recounted, quote, "The enemy worked with oriental doggedness to fortify himself in the hills, sometimes tunneling with hand labor from the reverse slope to the forward slope of the hill, where it is difficult to zero in on him with airstrikes or heavy howitzers. He might build tunnels as much as 1,000 yards long to enable him to take quick shelter from bombardment, yet move forward to meet an attack on the ground. The forward ends of these tunnels were usually camouflaged with great skill and care, and it took sharp observation to spot them. Once spotted, however, they could be knocked out by direct hits from our howitzers sighting directly at their targets. Our artillerymen demonstrated some pinpoint accuracy in blasting out those strong points with 8-inch howitzers that had been hauled into position by bulldozers." End quote. Those 8-inch howitzers are 2 or 3 millimeter artillery pieces, firing a projectile that weighs twice as much as the 155 shells commonly used today. Now, to complement these defensive fortifications, there is also growing quantities of tube artillery from the Soviet Union. And there wasn't just a single defensive line. The communists built line after line into the mountains, stretching back dozens of miles. In August, UN forces undertake a limited offensive to secure some key terrain, using ROK forces with support from the 2nd Infantry Division. There are a series of 3 hills that formed what would later be known as Bloody Ridge, and this attack was meant by General Van Fleet to showcase the new rehabilitated ROK Army with a regimental attack supported by American tanks, artillery, and air power. After 10 days of bloody fighting, the ROKs suffer 1,000 casualties and are driven back by a communist counterattack. And so American troops from the 9th Infantry Regiment are brought in, but they encounter trenches, hidden bunkers, and camouflage positions, the likes of which they had not encountered before. The North Koreans were able to use their tunnels and trenches to feed in reinforcements throughout the fight, and so, Despite expending 450,000 artillery rounds, the Americans are beaten back as well with heavy losses. Brigadier General Hayden Bull Boatner, the assistant division commander, instituted a replacement training program to train new soldiers in how to clear bunkers and trench lines, and he acquired flamethrowers to equip his men. After a month of fighting, the North Koreans finally pull back from Bloody Ridge and occupy positions along another ridge line some 1,500 meters north. This cost the UN forces 4,000 casualties and the North Koreans 15,000, all to seize 3 hilltops. This is bloody, messy, difficult fighting. Just east of Bloody Ridge is Hill 1179, its high elevation dominating an area known as the Punch Bowl, and Bloody Ridge itself. Ridgway described an attack on Hill 1179 as follows, quote, "After a vain effort by ROK Marines to dislodge the enemy from this prize, Van Fleet ordered units of the 2nd Division, with close air and artillery support, to take the hill. It was a bloody and wearying assault. Men had to zigzag up the wooded slopes and finally climb hand over hand up rocky steeps to close with the enemy. Sweating Korean laborers carrying on their ancient A-frames loads heavy enough to founder a pony provided the only transportation for ammunition, armament, and food. Infantrymen carried full loads themselves to set up the recoilless rifles, the communication lines, and the aid stations on the slopes. After 4 days of inch-by-inch advance, the enemy was finally shaken loose, and Hill 1179 was ours." End quote. This is followed by a UN attack on what would become known as Heartbreak Ridge, a 7-mile-long ridge just north of Bloody Ridge. Another 230,000 artillery rounds were fired, but due to the rough terrain, the UN forces have to make piecemeal frontal attacks into the teeth of communist defenses. They attack up the hills, blowing up bunkers and clearing trenches, but then, exhausted, reduced in strength, and low on ammunition, the North Koreans counterattack with fresh troops to drive them back. Illustrative of such attacks, Captain Pete Montfort's company attacked to seize a hill, leaving dead and wounded as the men advanced up the steep slopes. They managed to seize the hilltop at dusk, but they're low on ammunition, and due to enemy artillery fire, no more can be brought up. Remember, there aren't roads going up to their position. All supplies have to be carried by men to the top of the hill. T.R. Fehrenbach later wrote, quote, "A man who has never climbed the 1,000-foot slopes of the Taebaek Range cannot appreciate their steepness or the difficulties they caused an army used to mechanization." End quote. The division commander orders his artillery to, quote, "put a wall of steel around those men," end quote, and the guns fire all night. But come morning, the enemy is in control of the hilltop, and the company was wiped out to a man. Captain Montfort is found dead, lying on top of a machine gun that had run out of ammunition. The fighting at Heartbreak Ridge lasts 27 days. Ultimately, UN forces had to expand the scope of their attack to seize another ridge behind Heartbreak Ridge to limit the ability of the communists to bring in reinforcements. Although the firepower superiority of UN forces inflicts disproportionate losses on the communists, some 35,000 communist casualties to 5,600 Americans, but the communists have men to spare, and from the UN side, with the prospect of a ceasefire and ending the war in the background, there is little stomach to sustain those kinds of losses. Along those lines, the UN command doesn't authorize any larger offensives, and so you have localized fighting in one area on the front, bloody, vicious fighting at places like Heartbreak Ridge, whereas elsewhere along the line, the front is relatively quiet. And because the fighting is localized in 1 or 2 places at a time, those struggles for hilltops take on a prominence they otherwise wouldn't have, since it's the only major action going on at the time. It becomes a matter of pride and a contest of wills, where winning or losing the hill represents the fate of the war itself. The communists finally agree to resume truce negotiations on October 22nd, and this time, at the UN's insistence, they are held at a place called Panmunjom, truly in the no man's land between the front lines, and thus a neutral site. However, the communists insist that the ceasefire alliance must be decided first before the rest of the agenda is discussed, clearly wanting to end any pressure that UN forces might apply by continued attacks. The UN wants to do the opposite, since they want the communists to actually have an incentive to come to an agreement and stop the fighting. But after a month of deadlock, the UN agrees to a ceasefire along the current lines, provided the armistice is signed within 30 days. Well, surprise, surprise, the armistice is not signed within 30 days, but the communists take advantage of the respite to again dig in even deeper, and at this point the lines are so fortified that UN forces are unwilling to take any significant offensives. Even something like the attack on Bloody Ridge or Heartbreak Ridge is no longer politically acceptable. The front lines remain largely static, and tactics change. Now UN positions maintain a forward, thinly held outpost line to enable calls for fire on the enemy, while at the same time exposing the minimal number of troops to enemy fire. This is eerily reminiscent of the change in tactics on the Western Front in World War I as trench warfare and deadlock set in. Even with the front lines being largely quiet, casualties are still incurred every day, and with the ceasefire lines already decided, there's little incentive for the communists to actually agree to an armistice. As Ridgway remarked, quote, "The negotiations with the communists were my major concern throughout most of my remaining tenure in the Far East Command. They were tedious, exasperating, dreary, repetitious, and frustrating, and I very soon lost hope of an early end to the killing." End quote. As time passes, the soldiers began adding creature comforts to their fortifications and bunkers, such as heated shelters and mess tents to help endure the frigid winters. Sometimes tacit gentlemen's agreements are formed, like in one case where a platoon leader wants to snipe at the enemy lines with a 75mm recoilless rifle. He does so, and then the enemy responds with heavy artillery bombardments, and after that both sides agree to leave each other alone. In another case, a new regimental commander, Colonel Adams, takes over the 23rd Regimental Combat Team, and he is advised that the Chinese won't shoot at their patrols unless there are 3 or more vehicles present. Of course, Colonel Adams thinks this is hogwash and conducts a patrol with 3 jeeps, leading by example by riding along on the patrol. And sure enough, the Chinese attack the convoy, wounding Colonel Adams. Brigadier General Boatner, the deputy commanding general, is put in charge of the regiment until they can find a new colonel to take over. Due to the risk-averse nature of the entire UN chain of command, trying to minimize casualties, attacks in greater than platoon size now require corps-level approval. There is a growing tendency for senior leaders to micromanage their subordinate units, in part out of a desire to minimize risk to their reputation if their subordinates make a mistake, and in part out of boredom because there isn't anything more pressing to concern themselves with. At one point, when Brigadier General Boatner was commanding the 23rd Regimental Combat Team, a tank platoon conducted a probing attack that resulted in 2 tanks being disabled by mines. To avoid any casualties that might be incurred recovering these obsolete Sherman tanks, the crews fire on the hulks until the ammunition cooks off, and then they withdraw. However, the report of this action is included in the regimental sitrep that gets sent up to higher, and General Boatner gets an angry call from the division commander demanding that he explain himself. It turns out that the corps commander read the sitrep and was very angry that 2 tanks were destroyed. Boatner thinks quickly and responds that the report was wrong, the tanks were merely disabled, and then, to follow through with his claim, he mounts an operation under heavy artillery fire to recover the burned-out hulks. Later on, another platoon in Boatner's regiment makes an attack and runs into trouble. The company commander doesn't want to leave his men exposed, and so commits his other forces to extract them, at heavy casualties, while the rest of the battalion can do nothing but watch, lest they get in trouble for mounting an unauthorized operation. While the company commander and the chain of command all the way up still get in trouble for committing a company without corps authorization, and so they conduct an investigation to try and find some scapegoats. Thankfully, General Boatner intervenes, categorically refusing to hang anyone. He said, quote, "It's simply goddamn ridiculous and absurd for a combat man to be put in a position where his own subordinates that he's known, youngsters that he's eaten with, get killed or wounded, and someone thousands of miles back puts the bit on him as though he were callous about it." End quote. As ceasefire talks drag on, one of the sticking points becomes the issues of prisoners of war. For the UN forces, most of the prisoners were taken during the winter of 1950-51 during the Chinese counteroffensive. Conditions for these POWs were atrocious. They have to survive in the middle of winter with diets averaging about 1,400 calories a day, consisting of cracked corn and millet with occasional soya beans and cabbage. Now, this wasn't a deliberate attempt by the communists to starve the prisoners, but a reflection both of the poor logistical conditions of the communist forces and treating those prisoners equivalent to the way the Chinese would treat class enemies. The Korean or Turkish prisoners didn't starve to death because they had grown up on meager diets and their bodies were used to it, whereas the Western prisoners didn't fare so well, and many of them starved to death, and it wasn't until the following spring that the communists began to increase their food rations accordingly. The communists also did a great job of psychologically breaking down and isolating their prisoners. The communists made it a point to tell the prisoners that the officers and NCOs were equal to the enlisted soldiers, and to make it a point, they gave the officers and NCOs the most degrading jobs, while they had the soldiers elect their own leaders. This breakdown of discipline and leadership within the camps turned survival and resistance from a collective action, using the existing command structure, to an individual one. The American soldiers simply weren't psychologically prepared to resist this kind of attack. Many lost the will to survive, and few officers tried to take command. And this is actually the origins behind the U.S. Code of Conduct, which was developed in the years following the Korean War. The U.S. Code of Conduct includes articles such as, "If I'm captured, I will continue to resist by all means available. I will make every effort to escape and aid others to escape. I will accept neither parole nor special favors from the enemy." Or likewise, "If I am senior, I will take command. If not, I will obey the lawful orders of those appointed over me and will back them up in every way." Now, the communists made the prisoners attend re-education classes, using a combination of arguments, lies, confusion, force, and fears to make the prisoners question their loyalties. Many Americans knew that the communists were speaking lies or were wrong, but they weren't educated enough in civics or prepared ideologically to refute those lies. Only those with firm convictions of their faith, country, or Western civilization were able to stand firm, and the Chinese sought to identify and segregate them from the rest. Then, the Chinese decided to remove the American doctors from being in charge of sick call and replace them with their own communist doctors, while correspondingly increasing the available medical supplies and the diet of the prisoners, and so spread the lie that the American doctors simply didn't care whether they lived or died. However, not all the UN troops fared the same. The British NCOs fared well, and especially the Turks. The Turks maintained order within their ranks. The senior soldier was in charge, and the rest followed his lead. If a Turk was too friendly with the Chinese, they would hold a court, hear evidence, and, if guilty, would severely beat the offending soldier, along with his defense counsel for daring to praise such a traitor. If the guilty were to do it again, he would simply be killed. Now, on the other side of the lines, the UN forces had over 100,000 communist prisoners. The problem they had was more of trying to figure out what to do with so many prisoners. With the Chinese counterattack in the winter of 1950-51, UN forces were concerned about what to do with them if they had to evacuate the Korean peninsula. And so, as an expedient, they decided to relocate most of the prisoners to an island a few miles southwest of Busan, an island called Koje. To manage them, the 60th General Depot, later renamed the 2nd Logistical Command, is put in charge of feeding and caring for the prisoners. Now, these men know a lot about logistics, but little about securing or caring for prisoners of war. Major William Gregory, an engineer supply officer of the 60th General Depot, was told to go to Koje and was appointed as a procurement officer to buy them food and other supplies. When he arrives, there are 40,000 communist prisoners there and only 200 U.S. personnel to guard them. There's not even barbed wire to form compounds at this point. And due to the massive influx of people and the need to buy food for them, the economy on Koje nearly collapses until Major Gregory is given authority to buy food and supplies directly from Japan. Eventually, barbed wire compounds are built, but they are overcrowded. Some 6,500 prisoners in each compound, but they are not very secure, with the single fence separating each compound, and the guard posts are located inside of the fence. Thankfully, the prisoners of war are quiet and offer no resistance. 5 weeks later, an MP detachment arrives from Camp Gordon to take charge, but their emphasis was on teaching the prisoners about democracy and treating them as equals, as in, guards who strike the prisoners would be court-martialed. The basic attitude of the guards was something akin to, "We're here to help you and serve you," and to show them that capitalism would bring them wealth and full bellies. Furthermore, there is a lot of oversight and scrutiny from international organizations, something that was completely lacking in the communist POW camps. The military police screened the prisoners to try and determine which of the POWs are the true believer communists and which ones were Korean civilians pressed into service or nationalist Chinese sympathizers. Though this could be hard to determine from the outside, they were able to concentrate the worst die-hard communist leaders in Compound 76, headed by Senior Colonel Lee Hak-koo and his assistant Hong Chol. The communists began organizing. Representatives were elected in each of the compounds, but through violence and coercion, most of those elected supported Colonel Lee. Occasionally, the guards would find dead bodies, but they are unaware of the organization and intimidation going on behind the scenes. And slowly, the prisoners came to realize that they weren't going to be treated harshly like they would be in their own country. And so they began demanding things of the guards, first paper, paint, ink, and mimeograph machines, and then they started making banners and flags, distributing newsletters, all the while being applauded by the guards for being taught the value of labor and for their artistic designs. They began getting sheet metal and tools, and they start singing and chanting. Major Gregory finds one of the newsletters in his quarters one day and asks his local houseboy what it says. The boy responds, quote, "Oh, the communists are telling the people what fools the Americans are," end quote. By late 1951, there are over 85,000 POWs on Koje. They are well-fed, clothed, and industrious. The guards remained under heavy pressure to respect the prisoners' rights and privileges, and it was very clear from 8th Army and the Far East Command in Tokyo that no force of any kind could be used against the prisoners. Requests to get supplies and money to improve the compounds or security are rejected, in part because truce talks are underway and they don't want to spend money on a long-term solution to what might just be a short-term problem, and in part because, since they're on Koje-do, away from everyone else in Korea, the POW problem is largely out of sight, out of mind. However, the issue was not out of sight to the communists and the UN agents at Panmunjom. Many of the communist POWs were petitioning to not go back to their home country at the end of the war. When this is brought up in March 1952 at the negotiating table, the communists suggest that the prisoners should be screened to determine who wants to stay and who wants to go. As the screenings commence in April, the UN command finds that some 80% of the Chinese don't want to go back to mainland China, and only 50% of the Koreans want to go to North Korea. The communists are furious, and they insist that all the prisoners must be repatriated to them, and there will be no peace until they are. They recess the meetings on April 25th. Determined to gain some leverage on the POW issue, they send a communist officer dressed up as a private to surrender to the UN troops. This officer tells a memorized story about the murder of his family by the communists and his desire to surrender, and before long he ends up in Koje-do. And when there, he passes along his message to Colonel Lee in Compound 76, and they set their plans into motion. On May 7, 1952, Brigadier General Francis T. Dodd, commander of the POW camp at Koje-do, receives word that the spokesman from Compound 76 wants his presence to discuss something of importance. He goes to the compound to meet the delegation at the wire, as usual. While General Dodd is at the wire talking to the communists for over an hour, the gate is opened as a honey bucket crew comes in, and suddenly, at a signal, the POWs rush out, surround and seize General Dodd and drag him back inside the compound and close the gate behind him. They unfurl a large sign which says, quote, "We capture Dodd. As long as our demand will be solved, his safety is secured. If there happen brutal acts such as shooting, his life is danger." End quote. Inside the compound, the POWs unfurl their improvised weapons that they had been building and storing under their floors. General Charles Colson, the 1st Corps Chief of Staff, is brought in to take charge of the camp and secure Brigadier General Dodd's release. Over the next 3 days, negotiations are made with the communists inside Compound 76. the communists demand that Coulson sign a confession, which reads as follows, quote, 1. Immediate seizing the barbarous behavior, insult, torture, forcible protest with blood writing, threatening, confinement, mass murdering, gun and machine gun shooting, using poison gas, germ weapons, experiment object of A-bomb by your command. You should guarantee prisoners of war's human rights and individual life with the base on the international law. 2. Immediate stopping the so-called illegal and unreasonable voluntary repatriation of NKPA and CPVA prisoners of war. 3. Immediate seizing the forcible investigation, screening, which thousands of prisoners of war of NKPA and CPVA be rearmed and falled in slavery, permanently and illegally. And 4. Immediate recognition of the prisoners of war's representative group commission consisted of NKPA and CPVA prisoners of war and close cooperation to it by your command. This representative group will turn in Brigadier General Dodd, U.S. Army, on your hand after we receive satisfactory declaration to resolve the above items by your command. We will await your warm and sincere answer." End quote. Over the course of 12 hours of negotiations and back and forth, General Coulson eventually signs a reply which reads as follows, quote, 1. With reference to your item 1 of that message, I do admit that there has been instances of bloodshed where many prisoners of war have been killed and wounded by UN forces. I can assure in the future that prisoners of war can expect humane treatment in this camp according to the principles of international law. I will do all within my power to eliminate further violence and bloodshed. If such incidents happen in the future, I will be responsible. 2. Reference your item 2 regarding voluntary repatriation of Korean People's Army and Chinese People's Volunteer Army prisoners of war. That is a matter which is being discussed at Panmunjom. I have no control or influence over the decisions at the peace conference. 3. Reference your item 3 pertaining to forcible investigation, screening. I can inform you that after General Dodd's release, unharmed, there will be no more forcible screening or any rearming of prisoners of war in the camp, nor will any attempt be made at nominal screening. And 4. Reference your item 4, we approve the organization of a prisoner of war representative group or commission consisting of Korean People's Army and Chinese People's Volunteer Army prisoners of war according to the details agreed to by General Dodd and approved by me. End quote. Now, clearly, these are all lies, and General Coulson signed the confession just to secure General Dodd, and he thought it would be blatantly apparent that these were just lies, but the communist nation soaked up this huge propaganda win and broadcast it to the world. Pravda in Moscow published, quote, Koje Island, again the gloomy shadow of Majdanek, a Nazi extermination camp in Poland, has come upon the world, again the stench of corpses, the groans of the tortured. We learn that civilized Americans can be yet more inhuman, yet more infamous than the bloody Hitlerites. Dachau was a death camp, Majdanek was a death factory, Koje is a whole island of death. The American hangmen are torturing, tormenting, and killing unarmed people here. They are experimenting with their poisons on them, end quote, and so on and so forth. This is a huge propaganda victory, particularly among the neutral countries. Now General Dodd is released on May 10th, and he is dressed down by the Secretary of the Army for not simply bringing the spokesman to him under guard instead of going to the compound. And Brigadier General Dodd is demoted to colonel and forcibly retired. Now there are riots among the prisoners on Koje-do. They shout, chant, and wave banners while the guards watch helplessly. Many around the world began to joke about who is guarding whom on Koje-do. And so, to restore order, the 38th Infantry Regiment from the 2nd Infantry Division, reinforced by a further battalion, is sent to Koje-do. Brigadier General Bull Boatner, on R&R in Japan, is called to Tokyo to see General Mark Clark, who had just taken over the Far East Command from General Ridgway. Clark is angry at the Army's humiliation and is sending Boatner there to restore order. General Boatner, aware of all the political restrictions on the camp commandants in the past, says, quote, Yes, sir, I feel the situation is so bad over there, the POW is out of control to such an extent that it will require bloodshed to restore control, end quote. Clark replies, quote, I agree absolutely. I expect bloodshed, and I'll support you, end quote. Boatner takes over from General Coulson, who seemed largely unaware of the political firestorm caused by the agreement and that is now about to come crashing down on his head. Colson protested that General Clark had approved of him signing the confession, though he didn't have it in writing, just stenographic notes from the conversation. And predictably, General Colson is demoted to colonel and then retired. When Boatner arrives at his headquarters, one of the first things his XO asks him about is what uniform he wants to prescribe for the cocktail party celebrating his arrival. General Boatner is furious and categorically says that there will be no party and orders everyone to start wearing the same uniform and to start carrying their weapons. The XO protests, saying that there would be so many accidental discharges from their weapons that somebody might get hurt. Koje-do's problem, besides the lack of discipline, is that the island had been a dumping ground for the worst soldiers, unfit for service in the front lines. Boatner asks for permission to send the 400 worst troops back to the mainland, which he gets. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Woody Allen, battalion commander of 309 Infantry, makes a parking sign for General Boatner. On the front of it is labeled General Boatner, but given the past history of commandants of Koje-do, the reverse side is labeled Colonel Boatner, while General Boatner makes a similar sign for Colonel Allen with the reverse side labeled Major Allen. And so General Boatner sets about his plan to reassert control over the camp, to show the will to command, to build new compounds that are more secure, and then move the prisoners to the new compounds. The old days of POWs being encouraged to argue with the guards are over, and he knows that he only has a limited amount of time to get it done. And indeed, Compound 76 is planning a mass breakout attempt, with the inevitable slaughter of POWs being an even greater propaganda coup. On his second day in charge of Koje-do, General Boatner gets word that the 6,500 prisoners of war in one of the Chinese compounds are rioting. He remembered the Secretary of Army's admonition to General Dodd about how he shouldn't have gone out to the compound in the first place, but after a few seconds of consideration, Boatner realizes that he can't command the camp from behind a desk, and so he goes to the compound with only his aide and finds all 6,500 prisoners inside the compound lined up in ranks in perfect discipline with blue and yellow banners in hand, chanting, singing, and waving flags. Outside the wire are thousands of U.S. soldiers, both on and off duty, waving their fists and shouting at them. General Boatner summons Lieutenant Colonel Garrett, the senior U.S. officer on the scene, as well as the Chinese lieutenant colonel representing the compound and an interpreter. General Boatner commands Lieutenant Colonel Garrett to get his troops under control and to get the off-duty personnel out of there, after which he lets the Chinese officer speak through his interpreter, and the Chinese officer goes on a long list of grievances about Panmunjom, repatriation, and the Geneva Conventions, nothing about the actual riots themselves that are going on. Now, General Boatner, who served in China for many years and spoke fluent Mandarin, responds in Mandarin, words to the effect of, "What kind of BS are you talking about?" And the Chinese officer is speechless. Boatner continues telling him to go back and find out the real reason behind the demonstrations, and that they won't get anything until they disperse their men and have them go back to their tents. It turns out that the demonstrations were about a POW that was killed, and the Chinese have a long list of demands, a formal apology, permission for the whole compound to attend the funeral, and so forth, demands they had long been used to getting their way. Boatner permits a military funeral, but limits attendance to only a few and gives them some toilet paper and red dye so they can make red and white flowers for the funeral. Boatner gets more troops sent to the island, the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, and company-sized elements from the other UN governments, though this brought about plenty of grumbling from those nations. And, of course, he brings tanks. He begins ordering the compounds to tear down the various images of the communist leaders, national flags, and so forth that they had made and put up over the previous year, starting with the least dangerous compound first. The prisoners of war ignore their demands, so an hour after the deadline had passed, the compound gate is thrown open and 2 tanks rolled in, followed by infantry with rifles at port arms. They tear down the flags, portraits, and statues in 5 minutes, and then depart. This continues compound by compound, with tanks and armed infantry marching around the compound every day. The new compounds are built in 30 days, and these are much smaller and better secured. But now comes the final part of the plan, and the most difficult, the relocation of the prisoners. Boatner decides to start with the hardest compound first, Compound 76. The 187th Airborne and 38th Infantry dig in 2 battalions along the road to Compound 76, complete with machine guns and mortars, all in plain sight. Then they enter and clear an empty compound next to 76 with fixed bayonets and flamethrowers. The plan for relocation is broadcast over the loudspeakers, and they are told that if they resist, they will be responsible for the consequences. The next day, June 12th, the paratroopers move in, bayonets fixed, though their rifles do not have a round in the chamber, and they could only fire at express command. The POWs resist, brandishing spears, knives, and other improvised weapons. The paratroopers throw concussion grenades, breaking up the communist ranks and allowing many of them to be rounded up and relocated. A final 150 holdouts refuse to surrender, and they are met by the paratroopers in melee. Their resistance is broken, with some 43 POWs killed and 135 wounded, half of them by their fellow POWs in the fighting. But now the 6,500 communists in Compound 76 are broken down into groups of 500 and moved to their new accommodations. Seeing what happened to Compound 76, no other prisoners resist the relocation attempts. Soldiers find plans for the mass breakout attempt, set for June 20th, where they would cut the wire and make for the hills, killing anyone in their path. General Boatner had beaten the clock by 8 days. Negotiations continue at Panmunjom, with POW repatriation being the main sticking point. Some 80,000 of the 137,000 communist POWs don't want to return, and for their part, the communists only have some 12,000 prisoners left out of 260,000 they had taken. The vast majority of the missing prisoners are South Koreans who had died in captivity. Alternatives are proposed, screening of prisoners by neutral nations, even giving the communists a chance to talk with the prisoners one-on-one, but none are acceptable to them. And for their part, the communists know that 1952 is an election year in the U.S., and so they decide to bide their time. By October 1952, the UN delegates recess. Lieutenant General Harrison, the general in charge of the negotiations at this point, said, quote, "The United Nations Command has no further proposals to make. The proposals we made remain open. The UNC delegation will not come here merely to listen to abuse and false propaganda. The UNC is therefore calling a recess. We are willing to meet with you again at any time you are willing to accept one of our proposals, which could lead to an honorable armistice. I have nothing more to say." End quote. The U.S. finds itself in a bind. They aren't willing to pay the price in human life to change the military situation and put greater military pressure on the communists, and even if they did, fighting under the auspices of the UN limits their freedom to act unilaterally. Most of the other members of the UN forces want peace, not a new offensive. Furthermore, given how long the communists have had to dig in, the prospect of a major offensive, even if politically viable, would have been extremely costly in terms of life and slow. However, the U.S. also isn't willing to budge on the issue of prisoner repatriation. Forcing prisoners to go back to their own country goes directly against the principles of freedom and self-determination that the Western world upheld against the communist collectivism and dictatorship. While this is going on, the war continues on the ground. At this point, it's the communists who make the vast majority of the attacks, following the same pattern. The communists would place a large concentration of artillery fire on a hilltop and then assault it with superior forces. The communists would then hold the hill for a day or two until UN forces would counterattack and push them off at high cost of life. The lines have been static for so long, each of the hills now has its own name: Porkchop Hill, Old Baldy, and more. And these hill battles cost the U.S. 30,000 casualties a year, and in retrospect, military leaders realized that they should have kept military pressure on the communists back in the summer of 1951 until a ceasefire was signed, instead of the delays and stalemates. The U.S. presidential election comes and goes. Dwight Eisenhower wins the election and promises that if elected, he will go to Korea. He does, but the underlying geopolitical factors concerning U.S. and UN involvement in Korea does not change. He isn't willing to risk World War III or the heavy casualties it would take to push for victory in Korea, but he isn't willing to give up either, which would just invite more communist aggression. The ROK Army grows in strength and capability, and while still reliant on the Americans for most of their tanks and heavy artillery, they are much more capable of holding the line than they were in the first year of the war. The hill battles continue, and with it the contest of wills. In spring of 1953, the Chinese seize Old Baldy and Reno, and General Max Taylor, now commander of the Eighth Army, decides not to counterattack in an effort to keep casualties down. However, this only emboldens the Communists, and the fighting shifts to Pork Chop Hill, adjacent to Old Baldy, and now flanked since the Chinese are allowed to remain on Old Baldy. On April 16, 1953, the Chinese attack and seize Pork Chop Hill. Easy Company of the 21st Infantry Regiment, 7th Infantry Division, is holding the hill. They are largely overrun in their bunkers, and so King Company and 2 platoons from Love Company are committed in a counterattack. They reach the top, but are unable to clear the Chinese from the trenches and bunkers, and so George Company is also committed, but they too are unable to clear the Chinese off the hill. At noon, the company commander of King Company, Captain Joe Clemens, gets a message from battalion that says that survivors from Easy Company should be sent to the rear immediately, and George Company should withdraw in 3 hours. Confused, Captain Clemens tells the runner, quote, "Take this message back. Tell them the crisis here is not appreciated by battalion or regiment. I have very few men. All are exhausted. Russell has only 55 men left. When they go out, it is not reasonable that we could hold the hill." End quote. King Company was down to 35 men, Love Company 10, and Easy Company 12. Yet nothing changes. An hour later, battalion acknowledges receipt of the message, but says nothing more. When a public information officer dashes into Clemens' bunker with 2 staff photographers, Clemens asks him what in the world he's doing there. The officer replies that he's there to write the story and get pictures of the battle. Clemens tells him to forget the pictures and to get a message back to battalion, quote, "We must have help or we can't hold the hill." End quote. Again, battalion acknowledges receipt, but Clemens hears nothing more. Now battalion finally realizes how bad the situation is. They had received the earlier messages asking for help, but friendly strength figures or casualties were not included in them, and so battalion assumed that he was mostly at full strength, and his earlier messages were more about the intensity of the fighting instead of the actual urgent need for reinforcements. However, now that they realize the gravity of the situation, they are also aware of the political ramifications of committing more troops to a bloody battle, and so they ask Regiment to make a decision. Regiment passes the buck to Division, and Division, having been told by General Taylor to abandon Old Baldy just a few weeks earlier, passes the buck to Corps. Corps asks 8th Army for a decision, and then it ends up going all the way up to Far East Command in Tokyo. And this just goes to show how much the war has changed. The long, drawn-out stalemate and risk-averse nature of the UN command paralyzed decision-making and encouraged micromanagement, to the frustration of the men at the front lines. Time passes. Captain Clemens' men are out of water and low on ammunition. George Company pulls off the hill at 1500 hours as ordered, leaving him with only 25 men. Still hearing nothing, at 1700 he radios battalion and informs them he will have to withdraw. Finally, a counterattack is authorized. The division commander is on the scene and authorizes 2 battalions to attack. It's a hard fight, but they carry the day and reclaim Pork Chop Hill. At the end of March 1953, progress begins to be made in the negotiations, as the Communists suggest resuming sessions at Panmunjom. The Communists realize that Eisenhower isn't going to cut and run in Korea, and likewise they are very aware that the Republicans in general have been more hawkish in wanting to win the war. After all, they had supported MacArthur in his desire to continue the war to victory. The U.S. also tests its first tactical nuclear weapon in 1953, a 280mm nuclear artillery round, and some of the 280mm guns are deployed to Korea for conventional use, and quietly word is spread about the deployment of nuclear rounds for those guns to the Far East. Also in March 1953, Stalin dies, setting off a power struggle within the Soviet Union and suppressing any appetite for continuing to drag out the war. Furthermore, the POW propaganda war has turned in the UN's favor as the truth about the actual conditions in UN POW camps began to come out, and it becomes clear that the Communists would rather continue the bloodshed rather than suffer a propaganda defeat over prisoners who don't want to come back to their communist homelands. There are several more months of negotiations as the Communists try to salvage what they can and ultimately agree on a neutral third-party commission to screen POWs for repatriation. The last holdout for agreeing to a ceasefire is actually the South Korean president, Syngman Rhee. He doesn't want his nation and people to be divided, and with 1 million Korean civilians and soldiers dead, he doesn't want their deaths to be in vain. On June 18th, Rhee removes South Korean troops from under General Clark's command and releases 27,000 anti-communist POWs from their camps around Pusan. However, South Korea is not strong enough to go it alone, and they are dependent on the military support from the United Nations and particularly the United States. Rhee finally agrees to the armistice in exchange for a U.S. ROK Mutual Security Treaty, as well as the Americans paying to expand the ROK Army to 20 divisions and providing long-term economic aid. And by agrees to the armistice, I mean he doesn't sign or ratify the agreement, but he doesn't obstruct it either. The ceasefire is finally signed on July 27, 1953, though no formal peace treaty has ever been signed between the Koreas. There was a lot of dissatisfaction in the United States following the Korean War, both at the confusion of the nature of the war itself, being limited, undeclared, and indeed commonly referred to as the Korean conflict to avoid using the term war. Furthermore, the ending was frustrating too. 2 years of negotiation and no clear-cut victory. It left the war pretty much where it had started, and that was a bitter pill for Americans to swallow, used to the talk of unconditional surrender. Furthermore, it seemed to many that South Korea, a poor, impoverished nation lacking in industry, devastated by war, was doomed to remain dependent on U.S. military and economic support. Could this really be considered a victory? The war also did a lot to set the tone for the early Cold War. The communists learned that outright invasions of capitalist countries brought about a strong reaction, and instead began to focus on more subversive efforts, which would not present the West with a clear-cut moral issue, as the U.S. would learn in Vietnam. The United States' hopes of cashing in on its nuclear supremacy and post-World War II peace dividend were also dashed, and for the rest of the Cold War, the U.S. would not let its forces atrophy as they had prior to Korea. For their part, China gained substantially in the war. China, which had endured a century of humiliation at the hands of Western powers, starting with the Opium Wars in 1840 and continuing through World War II, had emerged from Korea as a force to be reckoned with. They had fought the best that the West had to offer, even the nuclear-armed United States, and forced them back from the Yalu River down past the 38th parallel. Even some nationalist Chinese soldiers who hated the communists still felt pride at the Chinese beating the Americans. This war also allowed Mao Zedong to consolidate power at home following winning the mainland in the Chinese Civil War. Fighting a foreign adversary helped unify the country, and the legitimacy gained from finally leading China to victory against Western powers helped immensely. However, the Communist Chinese were stopped in their plans to invade Taiwan by the advent of the war, and though they have never given up their desires to reclaim Taiwan, as is evidenced by the Chinese aggression around Taiwan that continues to the present day. In the years following the Korean War, the North Korean economy considerably outperformed that of the South. Most of the industry was located in the North, and they enjoyed substantial economic aid from China and particularly the Soviet Union. In 1954, North Korean per capita GDP was 4 times that of South Korea. It wasn't until 1967 that the South Korean total GDP surpassed North Korea, and it wasn't until 1973 that South Korean per capita GDP passed North Korea. Even in the early 1980s, when my father deployed to Korea for training exercises, Korea was still a very poor country. When I was stationed in Korea in 2012, he came to visit me, and he was shocked when he saw how modern the country had become in the span of just a few decades. As a final thought before closing out this series, I can't help but think of the war in Ukraine and the prospect, however undesirable to Zelensky, of having to settle for a ceasefire instead of victory. And this echoes the frustration Syngman Rhee felt in 1953, wanting to continue the fight to win instead of accepting a divided nation. However, both Rhee and Zelensky lack the military power to achieve victory on their own. They are both dependent on military support from more powerful nations to keep them in the fight. Nations willing to expend the resources and, in the case of Korea, the lives, to keep them from losing, but not to the point of victory. Instead, both conflicts are fought not in a vacuum, but the broader geopolitical landscape. In Korea, the desire to rebuild from the ashes of the World War II and avoid starting a third world war with nuclear weapons tempered the goals and resources employed by the UN forces and also, to a lesser extent, the communists. Likewise, in Ukraine, there is a desire to avoid escalating into a direct conflict with Russia and maintaining an adequate reserve of munitions and equipment in the event another war breaks out or the war widens, especially with an eye towards China with their growing naval and air forces. All in all, the Korean War is a fascinating war, both from the heroism on the ground to the generals and politicians coming to grips with the dynamics of limited war in the greater context of the Cold War. Unfortunately, it is too often forgotten, not having the scale or moral clarity and victory found in World War II, but also not having the drawn-out cultural impact on the military and society like the Vietnam War did. I hope you enjoyed this series. Thank you again for listening, and if there's anyone you think might be interested, please share this with them. For the next series, the Wheels of History podcast is going to go to World War II in the Pacific, the Battle off Samar in the Philippines, where Japanese battleships surprised a small U.S. carrier force that led to the fight of their lives and the U.S. Navy's finest hour. If you enjoyed listening to this, please support the Wheels of History podcast. You can support the podcast on Patreon. For just $5, less than the cost of a Subway sandwich, you can gain access to a bonus episode covering more details on the sources I researched for the series, my experiences being stationed in Korea, and a look at the differences between the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15. Thank you very much, have a great day, and I'll see you next time on the Wheels of History podcast.